Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another exciting set of APES notes. Today, we're going to talk about populations, and I completely blame Ramon for me having theme music. Populations are groups of organisms that are members of the same species that live in the same place at the same time. You can talk about varying populations. For example, I could talk about the population of roaches in Sunset High School. Or I could talk about the population of humans in the city of Dallas, or the population of squirrels in the United States of America. It just varies depending on what type of population you want to talk about. Populations can differ in size as time passes. They can grow larger, they can grow smaller, they can even migrate or change habitats. Number of terms that we have to know in order to be able to discuss populations intelligently. So, for example, sex ratios are the ratio of males to females. This is important because it determines reproduction. For example, if you have a lot of males and very few females, that kind of limits reproduction because the females are the ones that can bear young. On the other hand, if you have lots of females and fewer males, it's okay because a male can have offspring with multiple females at once. This brings us to the idea of fertility or fecundity. Fecund means fertile, capable of producing babies. So that's the reproductive capacity of your females. Like I said, it's the female's reproductive capacity that's going to have the big effect because they're the one who will have to basically put all the energy and time into making offspring. The age structure of a population shows you the number of organisms that exist at each age. So you can have an age structure with lots of older organisms, in which case you're not going to have as much reproduction, or you can have a lot of juveniles, which means very soon, as soon as those mature, you're going to have a lot of reproduction going on. When you have somebody who's studying population dynamics, that means that they're studying the changes in the size of a population over time. Also composition of the population, such as the number of males, number of females, who's at what age, so the age structure. The size of a population is affected by the growth rate, which is the change in your population. It can be negative or positive per unit time. The growth rate depends on three factors: natality, or the birth rate, so how many individuals are being born into the population in a given time period; the mortality, or the death rate, how many organisms are dying; and the migration, numbers moving into or out of the population. Migration consists of two factors. You have immigration. Notice it starts with an I. That, I like to think, stands for individuals coming in to the population, so the I stands for in. That's going to add to your population. Emigration is the opposite of immigration. Emigration, you'll notice, starts with an E, kind of like exit. These are individuals who are leaving or exiting the population. Two different types of factors that can influence your population: density independent and density dependent, and we're going to talk about those on the next couple of slides. These will affect whether or not the mortality rate increases or the natality rate increases. Natality, remember, is birth rate. It's going to add to the population. Mortality is death rate. It's going to take away from the population. It's important to know the difference between density independent and density dependent population control factors. The name is pretty obvious. If it's density independent, it doesn't matter how big or how small your population is. These factors are going to affect your population. A lot of times natural disasters tend to be density independent. Density dependent control factors, on the other hand, are going to have a greater and greater effect as your population gets bigger. And we're going to talk about each of those individually. So as I said on the previous slide, density-dependent factors are going to be more of an issue for population size when you have higher population densities. That's more individuals living in a smaller area. This is because you're going to have increased competition for resources, maybe food, maybe shelter, and when you have individuals lose that competition, they're probably going to tend to die. Also, when you have a higher population density, it's easier for predators, parasites, and infectious agents like bacteria, viruses, or fungi to jump from one organism to another. Well, that goes for parasites and for infectious agents, but predators are able to locate their prey more easily. So as your population density goes up, you're going to have a higher number of organisms dying due to predation, or dying due to disease, or dying because of starvation. Density independent factors don't depend on how many organisms you have living in an area. They're going to kill or they're going to increase survival regardless. So some of the abiotic factors in an ecosystem, things like temperature, precipitation, humidity, acidity, salinity, those are going to affect the population regardless of how many there are. So if you're talking about a population of plants, let's say the salinity or the salt content of your soil increases, what that will do is that will decrease your plant population, no matter whether you have 100 of a plant species living in an area or 100,000 of a plant species living in an area. Also, natural disasters, catastrophes, things like floods, tsunamis, fire, drought, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, anything that's going to cause harm, those will also reduce the population regardless of how many organisms you have living there. We're going to talk about population growth. There is unfortunately some math involved here, and we will go over this more in class with some practice problems. There are also some typical graphs that describe certain types of growth, and you will need to be able to recognize these. Just in case you needed a visual for how we have organisms entering and leaving a population, here we have this nice, lovely group of penguins. So the ways that you add to the population: births, obviously, and immigrants coming into the population. The way you're going to take away from the population, you have the dead fellow on the bottom left, and you have the emigrating fellow on the bottom right. Both of those are leaving the population, and if you have more deaths and emigrants than you have births and immigrants, then you're going to have a decrease in your population instead of an increase. There are two ways that we can express our rates of population change. Remember, a rate is how something changes per unit time. So we can just express the straight up population rate, for example, the numbers per whatever unit time. That could be you have a growth rate of 5%, you will have a birth rate of 2,000 births per year, you have a death rate of 12,000 deaths per year. That would be numbers per unit time. And then you can also have per capita. Per capita is going to be the number of births, deaths, or organisms entering the population per a certain number of individuals. So a lot of times what will happen is you'll have a birth rate or a death rate expressed for every 1,000 individuals. So for example, for every 1,000 individuals in a population, what we see up here is there are 122 live births. So if we had 10,000 individuals in the population, then since 10,000 equals 1,000 times 10, that we would have 1,220 live births. If the math messes with your head, don't worry. Like I said, we're going to go over plenty of math examples in class. Sorry, guys. This is the first of the graphs that you have to be able to recognize for population growth. This is exponential growth. It's also, if you look at the shape of the graph, it's called a J-curve because it kind of looks like a J that somebody didn't finish drawing. Exponential growth, which is sometimes called logarithmic growth, is where you're going to have the population growth rate keep increasing and increasing faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. This is not very often seen in nature. Most of the places where you're going to see this is when you have individuals moving into an area for the first time, so colonizing individuals. Usually you'll have limiting factors start to slow down the growth, and so there will no longer be exponential growth. That's going to be more realistic. This next graph is more realistic to what actually happens in nature, so let's look at several of the phases in this graph. You start out with a period of exponential growth, and as you approach the line labeled carrying capacity, your growth rate starts to slow down. The carrying capacity we'll talk about in more detail later, but it's basically the limit to the number of individuals you can have living in that environment. As you get closer to the carrying capacity, those density-dependent population control factors will start kicking in and lowering your population growth rate. So that's the environmental resistance that you see starting to happen when you're approaching the carrying capacity. As you approach the carrying capacity, your growth rate slows down, and you may even lose members of the population so that your population will dip below the carrying capacity. And then your population can fluctuate around the carrying capacity. The beginning part, especially of this graph, is called logistic growth, or also an S curve. Notice it kind of looks like a stretched out S. So those are our two curves, S curves and J curves. Just a really quick, simple picture without all the words that we had on the other slides. Here you have a J curve, it's the one in green, it's exponential growth, and then you have the S curve that's pictured in red. It's also known as logistic growth. Next, we're going to look at several of the equations you need to know, memorize for the AP test. Keep in mind they will not give you a formula chart, so any formulas you need to know, you're going to have to go in there with them in your head. There are 3 or 4 major ones that we need to know for populations. They're all upcoming on the slides. If you look on your notes, I believe they're in the top left-hand part of the first page. I just have a little thing there that says what equations you need to know for the test. So this is doubling time. It's the amount of years it takes to double a population. Doubling time is 70 divided by the growth rate R, and R is expressed as a percent. So let's say that your population is growing at 1%. That would mean that your doubling time is 70 divided by 1, not 70 divided by 0.01. It's 70 divided by 1%. So that means in 70 years, your population is going to double. This is one of the more complicated equations that you need to know for the AP test, and this is the general equation for growth rate. I want to point out that R here is also the growth rate, just like in the previous equation, but that's R as a decimal. So if your growth rate is 1%, then the R that you see in this equation would be 0.01, which is when you take 1% and you convert it to a decimal. Don't worry, we'll go over that in class. So R equals births plus immigrants, in parentheses, minus the total number of deaths plus emigrants divided by whatever your starting population is. Sometimes we tend to abbreviate this R equals BIDE, B-I-D-E. You just have to remember the B and the I are added together, the D and the E are added together, and you're going to subtract the deaths and emigrants from the births plus immigrants. You're subtracting the number of individuals that leave the population from the number that added to the population. So you're basically looking at the net number of individuals entering the population, dividing that by the starting population. Don't worry, like I said, we'll play with the math in class. Now we get to the crudes, and I don't mean that animated movie that came out in the recent couple of years. Crude birth rate and crude death rate are some of those factors that are per a certain number of members of the population. Crude birth rate is the number of births divided by your total population times 1,000. And what that number will end up meaning is that will be the number of live births you have for every 1,000 individuals in a population. Same thing for crude death rate. You're just taking deaths and substituting it for births. So it's the number of deaths divided by the starting population times 1,000. So the crude death rate, or CDR, is also equivalent to the number of deaths for every 1,000 members of your population. This makes it pretty handy when you're trying to compare different countries or different populations that are really different from each other. If you're trying to compare the population of the United States, for example, with the population of Cuba, Jamaica, any smaller country, you use crude birth rate and crude death rate. Altogether, these are the 4 equations that you need to know. You can kind of think of it as 3 equations since crude birth and crude death rate are so similar to each other. You do need to memorize these. You do need to be able to do simple algebra with these. For example, you may be given on the growth rate equation R equals births plus immigration minus deaths plus immigration over starting population. You may end up being given your births and your immigration, your starting population, and your growth rate, and have to find out how many individuals total died or emigrated. We'll play with those equations more in class. If you are the flashcard type, this is a great thing to make a flashcard of. Hey guys, you still awake out there? I figured with all that math, your eyes were probably starting to glaze over. Actually, by this point in class, half of you guys would probably have your heads down and be snoring pretty loudly. So I just wanted to take a moment and check and make sure y'all are up. Also, if you want to take a break, this is pretty close to the halfway point. There's not a ton left. Go take a potty break, relax a little, and then come back and get ready to finish up your notes. All right, now that you're all nice and refreshed, let's talk about carrying capacity. So carrying capacity, which will often be a straight horizontal line on any graphs of population you look at, is the maximum population that can be sustained long term. This can end up being degraded if there's environmental damage, and it's a pretty hard thing to measure. You really only know the carrying capacity if you can, say, graph a population and start looking at the value around which the population won't increase any further. Now, a common analogy for the carrying capacity is, let's say that you have a bucket. And that bucket's going to represent your population. Any water you pour into the bucket, every drop of water you add is like adding individuals to the population. So if you say had a hose pouring water into this bucket, the water going in through the hose, that would be your annual reproduction, the members added to your population. Now, if you start to overflow your bucket, that's like you having a population that's getting beyond its carrying capacity. That bucket and its volume represents your carrying capacity. When you start getting above that carrying capacity, your density dependent population limiting factors are going to kick in and more organisms are going to start dying off. You can only put so much water in a bucket. Similarly, you can only have so many organisms of the same species supported by an area. You may come to hate this graph as time passes. This is a common graph that is seen on the AP test, on several AP test questions. And in it, you'll either be asked to identify one or another of the lines, or you'll be asked some question that associates with one of these lines. So let's go over what each of these lines represents. So the line labeled A, that is straight up plain exponential growth. That is a J curve. B is what's called dynamic equilibrium. So you do have your growth, it's slightly exponential until you're nearing the carrying capacity, and then it fluctuates around the carrying capacity. It's dynamic, it's changing, but it's around the same value, which is the equilibrium part. C is your straight up logistic S curve. And that's going to be a curve that it's going to decrease as you approach the carrying capacity. D would be arithmetic growth, which is just you're adding 5 members to the population every year, or 5 members to the population every hour, or something like that, depending on what species you're looking at. And finally, E is the carrying capacity. So you'll notice both lines B and C, which are dynamic equilibrium and logistic growth, both of those have slower growth rates as you approach E, the carrying capacity, which is the best way to identify the carrying capacity. This slide should look fairly familiar. It's the reproductive strategies we talked about when we talked about our endangered species project, and I introduced these ideas really quickly. R strategists and K strategists have different methods for trying to produce offspring that will survive and pass on their genes. You can be anywhere on a spectrum from R strategist to K strategist, so you can have characteristics of both of these types of organisms. So let's look at the characteristics of each of these guys. R strategists are going to be the ones that reproduce very rapidly. If you want to think about it, you can think of the R standing for rabbit or rat or rodent, and it stands for rapid growth. These guys will tend to inhabit unstable environments where they can experience exponential growth. So let's say they're colonizing a new environment or their population just got knocked down. They can grow very quickly. They have short lifespans, they reproduce very early in life, and when they reproduce, they're churning out a lot of babies. Those babies are small, they mature quickly, and they then go on to produce their own offspring very quickly as well. These organisms don't put a lot of energy into raising their offspring, they don't care for them. You have examples like sea turtles where the turtles will lay their eggs on a beach and they'll leave and the eggs have to hatch, the turtles have to make it to the sea all on their own. Then you have K strategists. You can think of K for any sort of mammal you can think of whose name starts with a K. I tend to think kangaroos. They tend to inhabit stable environments where their population will grow very slowly. They have longer lifespans and they'll take a while before they are able to reproduce. So they reproduce later in life. They'll produce fewer offspring at a time. This could be anywhere from the one offspring humans produce to a litter like cats and dogs produce with up to like 10 offspring. Those offspring will mature more slowly, and while those offspring are maturing, the parents are going to take care of them for a while. For example, if you're a human, you'll end up taking care of your offspring for 18 years. These reproductive strategies, back to the graphs that we've been looking at, our strategists are going to tend to exhibit J curves when you look at their population as it grows over time. K strategists are probably going to end up reaching their carrying capacity and showing dynamic equilibrium where they fluctuate or go up and down around the carrying capacity. R strategists will generally not reach the carrying capacity since they're in unstable environments. Something will probably come along to wipe them out. By the way, the abbreviation for carrying capacity, for reasons I don't remember and don't understand, it's represented by the letter K. That's why K strategists have that name, because their population tends to hang out around the carrying capacity. Just a few more details about R strategists. They have the ability to reproduce extremely quickly and fill up an area. But they tend to be generalists, as you see where it says competition in the purple and pink chart. They are generalists, which means they'll generally be outcompeted by species that are more specialized to that ecosystem. They can live in climates that are unpredictable, and we'll talk about survivorship in the next in about a couple of slides. Their population size can decrease and increase dramatically, but hey, if half of them get wiped out, it's okay. They can reproduce quickly and build their population back up. And you can read all the other things on that slide. It's basically what we talked about on the first slide when we talked about R and K strategists. Some examples of R strategists: you have bacteria, algae, which are single-celled photosynthetic creatures. You have rodents such as rats, mice. A lot of insects are R strategists. Some people consider rabbits R strategists, though they're mammals. They'll mostly be more along towards the K strategist end of the spectrum. And there are a lot of those fast-lived plants like grasses and other annuals that live for a year. Now let's get into the K strategists. K strategists, if you'll notice and you'll think about it, for the endangered species projects y'all did, a lot of the endangered species were K strategists. You're never going to find cockroaches on an endangered species list. K strategists have slower population growth. They tend to live in environments that are settled, that are fairly constant, and they tend to have strong specialization. So they're specialist species. They're going to have adaptations to their ecosystem, so then if the ecosystem changes for any reason, they'll end up having more members of the population die off. They tend to live for a longer period of time, and they put a lot of energy into their young. They put a lot of energy not only into producing large young, but they put a lot of energy into making sure that those young survive to adulthood. So when you think about R strategists and K strategists, it's kind of an example of quality versus quantity. In R strategists, they go for quantity. They're going to flood the area with as many organisms, as many babies as they can, and hope that some of them survive to adulthood. K strategists, on the other hand, are going for quality. They'll have fewer offspring, but they're going to make sure that those offspring are well able to survive. All right, I promised you that we were going to talk about survivorship curves, so here they are. If you'll look at this graph carefully, you'll notice the x-axis is the age in relative units. When I say relative units, that means early in the lifetime of an organism, late in the lifetime of an organism. The y-axis is the number of survivors. So let's take a look at humans. Humans are the top curve, the red one, that's labeled type 1. Humans, when we're born, let's say there are 1,000 individuals who are born in a human population. When they're born, as they age, for the most part of life, for the very early parts of life, you don't have a lot of organisms die off. So most of those 1,000 babies will be living for probably the first 2/3 of the lifespan of a human. And then as they get older, they start dying off. So that's the old lady where you see the steep drop in the number of surviving individuals. Let's look at the oak tree. The oak tree has the green line. It's located on the bottom and it's labeled type 3. If you'll notice, out of the 1,000 acorns that were released into an environment, very few of them survive past the earliest stages of life. Very few of them will survive to become saplings, which are small trees, and of those, you'll tend to have most of those that make it to the sapling stage will reach adulthood. And once you make it past that initial dying off period, you're good to go. Chances are pretty good you're going to survive for a large part of the lifespan of the organism. Talk about the type 2 survivorship curve, the one in blue, and those are hawks. So if you start out with 1,000 hawk eggs, of those 1,000 hawk eggs, probably about half of them will end up surviving until you have the chick stage, or the medium part of the lifespan of the animal. And then you'll see a steady decline in the number of organisms that exist all the way through the eldest hawks. I want to point something out with this type of graph. This is not showing you how the population is changing over time. So we're not saying that your total population starting out for each of these is 1,000. So you're not starting out with 1,000 humans and then looking at how their population changes. You're starting out with 1,000 individuals of the same age, born at the same time, and looking to see how much of the total lifespan of that organism that they will live. So humans will tend to live, more humans will make it to the later stages of their lifespan, and oak trees, very few of them will make it to the later stages of their lifespan. Hawks, on the other hand, experience constant loss. They're going to be losing individuals basically constantly throughout their lifespan. So, to relate survivorship curves back to the population reproduction strategies, type 1 survivorship curves, like those seen in humans, are mostly seen amongst K strategists. Remember, they are more quality over quantity. So, while they may have fewer offspring, most of those offspring will survive to maturity. Type 3 survivorship curves are more typical of R strategists. Remember, they are quantity over quality. So, while they will produce a large amount of offspring, most of those offspring will die off very early in the lifespan, and few of them will survive to maturity. Type 2 survivorship curves are an intermediate reproduction strategy. So during the lifespan, you basically, at any point in the lifespan, have an equal chance of the offspring dying off. This is found in many types of songbirds. It's found in some annual plants, some lizards, and other small mammals as well. We've looked at several reproduction strategies, and we've also looked at survivorship curves. Now let's look at aspects in one given time period. Let's look at the population density. If you've taken AP Human Geography before, you may have talked about density of populations as it regards humans. Population density is a pretty simple idea. It's the number of inhabitants, number of organisms you have per unit area. Often this unit area is square meters or square kilometers, depending on how large of an area you're looking at. Some organisms that have low population densities are those that are very territorial, such as tigers. They will defend a territory against other tigers living there, so they tend to be pretty spaced out. There are also plant species that live in marginal environments. They are kept from growing too close to each other because there just aren't enough resources to share. Some organisms that live in high densities are those that live in colonies. Corals will live in high density, termites, ants, those when they live in nests, they're living at a high density. Rabbits will also live at a high density as well. Just to relate this to something that might be familiar to you, this is a graph. This is a map showing the population density of the United States by county back in 1990. So the more towards the darker purple shade you are, the higher the density of the population living in that county. The more towards the yellow shading that you are, the lower the density you have. So you'll notice we have areas of high density more towards the East Coast, areas of low density in the western parts, the areas that are predominantly desert. To expand on this further, looking at the human population, here is a map showing the population density of various countries in the world. You'll notice the theme is very similar. The darker purple colors are at the highest density. The lighter yellower colors are at the lowest density. So you'll notice Greenland, Iceland, Russia, Australia, Those are countries with very low population densities. Russia, Greenland, and Canada have lower temperatures. Australia is mostly desert on the interior. On the other hand, you have other countries with very high population densities, some of the countries in the Caribbean, in Central America, European countries. India is a very high population density as well. Population density is pretty closely linked to the idea of population distribution. That's how the organisms are spread out within an area. This depends on several things. For example, the characteristics of the habitat. Are there sufficient resources, sufficient nutrients to support a larger population density or not? Also, some features of the organisms themselves will affect the population distribution, like the example of tigers we spoke about before, that they are territorial and so they won't really live in close proximity to other tigers. There's also the autotoxicity or allelopathy in plants, which will keep them regularly spaced out. There are three major types of population distributions. They are random, uniform, or clumped. There are three diagrams that show how the populations would be dispersed in any of the three patterns. So if populations are spaced out regularly, they'll look like the picture on the far left. In the middle, you have more of a random distribution. There's no particular pattern to how the organisms are spaced out. And on the far right, you see a clumped distribution where organisms tend to live in groups with each other. Now we'll take a look at each of the three distribution types. First off, random distributions. This is not extremely common in nature because it can only happen where you have uniform, widely spread out resources available throughout the year. The position of each individual in this area will be independent of the position of others. That implies that there's not going to really be any strong interaction between individuals. This tends to be seen in some trees and some invertebrates, like the spiders that are shown on the picture on the slide. Uniform distributions are often caused by either competition or by territoriality. Territoriality will cause organisms to spread themselves out. Competition will cause organisms to spread themselves out as well for a different reason, because if they try to grow in too close proximity to each other, the organisms will be competing for the same resources. There's a chance that one or both of the organisms will die. So, places where there's common competition, in forests, there's competition for root space and crown space so that you can get enough light. And in deserts and savannas, there's competition for moisture. That's going to prevent organisms from growing too closely together. We already mentioned autotoxicity and allelopathy, which is the tendency of plants to use chemicals to prevent other plants from growing in too close proximity. This is especially going to be found in environments where there are very limited resources. On this slide, I've included for you guys a nice little picture of a uniform distribution of a population of birds. Notice how they're evenly spaced out, and that's because when they set up their nests, if another bird builds a nest too close, they'll actually peck at each other until the bird moves away. So that ends up causing an even distribution of the birds. When distributions of populations are clumped, a very common reason for that is because there is a high concentration of some sort of resource, water, food, shelter in a particular area, and so organisms will tend to live in that area. Other reasons are behavioral reasons. For example, they may live in close proximity so that they're able to find each other for reproduction, or they may exhibit social behavior that encourages them to live in close proximity. So they may be in colonies or herds or clusters. In case you're wondering, yes, we are done with the notes now. I hope you enjoyed this, and the next set of notes should be up in a couple of days. Have a great day.